In 1899, Galveston shipped more cotton than any port on Earth. Its wharves made it the fifth most important port in the United States, and $85 million in exports passed through a city of only 38,000 people. 1 year later, water as deep as 15 feet covered every block. At least 6,000 residents were dead, and a ridge of wreckage stretched 3 miles through the city. This was the Wall Street of the Southwest. Before Galveston had a bank, a cotton exchange, or a brick warehouse, it had a narrow opening in the coast where deep water came close to dry land. The dry land was not impressive. Galveston Island was part of a chain of barrier islands laid along the Texas coast, a low strip of sand running roughly 32 miles from end to end and averaging about 2 miles across. The Gulf worked against its southern face. On the other side lay shallow bays, marshes, oyster beds, and the mainland beyond them. The island had no dependable supply of fresh water, no river leading into the interior, and little of what an early settler ordinarily looked for when choosing a place to build. At the eastern end, however, currents moving between Galveston Bay and the Gulf kept open a natural harbor. Ships could enter, find protection behind the island, and anchor closer to the coast than they could at most other points between New Orleans and Veracruz. That difference was enough. The island was not empty before Europeans put names on it. Karankawa people used this coast for hunting and fishing, moving through a landscape of salt water, shell, marsh grass, and open beach. The barrier islands were part of their territory, not obstacles at its edge. Spanish expansion found the Texas coast difficult for the same reasons the Karankawa understood it well. The shore offered few easy places to land, few reliable sources of drinking water, and long distances across country that could turn wet, dry, or impassable according to the season. In November 1528, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and other survivors of a Spanish expedition were wrecked on an island they called Malhado, the island of misfortune. Galveston has often been identified as that place, although the location remains disputed, and some historians place the landing farther down the coast. The uncertainty fits the landscape. The islands were low, similar in outline, and capable of being altered by a single storm. A shoreline seen from the deck of a damaged ship did not always remain where a later map expected to find it. More than 2.5 centuries passed before the harbor received the name that would endure. In 1785, the Spanish navigator José de Evia charted the Texas coast and named the bay for Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish governor who had helped fight the British along the Gulf Coast during the American Revolution. Later mapmakers carried the name from the bay to the island. For the moment, Galveston existed more clearly in ink than in timber. The first serious attempts to occupy the harbor came not from town builders, but from men operating between nations. Spain still ruled Mexico. Rebels wanted it removed. Merchants in New Orleans saw opportunities in cargoes that could be captured, condemned, relabeled, or quietly moved through customs. The harbor behind the island offered a place close enough to Louisiana for trade, and far enough from authority for nearly everything else. In 1816, Louis Michel Airy arrived with ships, sailors, and a commission connected to the Mexican struggle against Spain. A Mexican rebel envoy proclaimed Galveston a port of the Mexican Republic and named Airy its resident commissioner. A rebel flag went up over a settlement that consisted largely of shacks on sand. Its titles were grander than its buildings. Airy's privateers cruised the Gulf for Spanish vessels and brought their prizes back to Galveston. One captured cargo of coin and indigo was valued at approximately $778,000, an extraordinary fortune passing through a place with no permanent government and scarcely a street. Some goods entered New Orleans in bales stripped of identifying marks. Others never troubled the customs officers at all. The harbor was already performing the function that would later make Galveston rich. It gathered ships, cargo, and money at one narrow point. The legal descriptions would change. When Ory sailed away in 1817, Jean Lafitte and his followers took control of the settlement. Lafitte called the camp Campeche and used it as a base for privateering, smuggling, and supplying other men who worked the Gulf beyond the clean boundaries of national law. For 3 years, vessels arrived with captured goods, while rough buildings collected along the bayside of the island. There were officials, appointments, proclamations, and even documents issued in the name of the settlement. There was still no ordinary town. In 1821, pressure from the United States forced Lafitte to leave. The shacks thinned out. The flags changed again. The harbor remained. Independent Mexico designated Galveston an official port of entry in 1825 and placed a small customs house there 5 years later. That modest building represented something the pirates had never provided: a government prepared to collect duties, record cargo, and recognize the harbor as a permanent entrance into Texas. During the Texas Revolution, control of that entrance became a military question. The Texas Navy used Galveston. As Santa Anna's army advanced in 1836, families and officials retreating eastward took shelter on the island. It was a last place to withdraw without leaving Texas altogether. It was also an uncomfortable refuge. Fresh water was scarce, accommodations were poor, and many of the people waiting there were eager to depart as soon as news arrived that the Texans had won at San Jacinto. The harbor could protect ships. It did much less for families obliged to live beside it. That same year, Michel Menard and a group of investors obtained 4,605 acres at the eastern end of the island. They looked at the sand and saw neither a pirate camp nor an emergency refuge. They saw the place where the commerce of an entire republic would have to pass. Surveyors imposed straight lines on the shifting ground. Streets crossed avenues. Blocks became lots. The irregular edge of the harbor was answered with a grid. On April 20th, 1838, the Galveston City Company began selling those lots. The buyers were purchasing pieces of an island that lacked drinking water and stood only a few feet above the Gulf. What gave the paper value was behind them, on the quieter side of the sand. The harbor came first. The city was drawn around it. The first Galveston was not built around a public waterfront. It was built around a collection of private piers. In 1839, Ephraim McLean opened Coon's Wharf at the foot of 18th Street. That same year, the mercantile partners Thomas McKinney and Samuel May Williams built another landing at 24th Street. Each structure reached from the island into the channel for a practical reason. A merchant who owned the pier could receive his own cargo, store it in his own warehouse, arrange its sale, and load the outward shipment without waiting for another man's permission. The water was deep by Texas standards, but not deep everywhere. Sandbars at the entrances to coastal bays sometimes left only 5 or 10 feet beneath a vessel. Large ships often anchored outside and transferred their cargo into smaller, shallow boats called lighters. Crates, barrels, passengers, and cotton bales crossed the final distance in pieces. Every transfer cost money. Every delay created another opportunity for a merchant who could solve it. Charles Morgan did. In 1837, he placed a steamship in service between New Orleans and Galveston and combined his larger vessels with shallow-hulled schooners that could work the Texas coast. By May of that year, 40 sailing vessels were regularly carrying passengers and freight to and from Texas. The next year brought daily arrivals at Galveston. In March 1839, the English bark ambassador delivered the first direct cargo from England. By the end of the year, more than $1 million in trade was passing through a town scarcely old enough to have settled the ownership of its streets. In 1840, Galveston had more than 3,000 residents and was already the largest city in Texas. The town did not manufacture most of what made it valuable. It stood between the producers and the buyers. From the river bottoms of the Brazos and Colorado came cotton and sugar. From ranches and farms came hides, cattle, pecans, molasses, and cottonseed oil. Wagons carried loads across hard ground when the weather allowed it. Flatboats moved bales down the rivers. Coastal steamers and shallow craft gathered the cargo and brought it toward Galveston, where commission merchants graded it, stored it, advanced money against it, and arranged passage to New Orleans, New York, or Europe. Cotton was the center of the system. It was compact enough to travel, durable enough to wait in a warehouse, and valuable enough to support credit long before it reached a mill. A bale could be pledged for a loan, insured against loss, sold through an agent, compressed to take less room, and counted again when it entered a ship's hold. Galveston earned money at nearly every step. The cotton itself came from enslaved labor. Slavery expanded rapidly across eastern Texas as planters opened fertile land along the rivers. In 1850, Texas contained more than 58,000 enslaved people. 10 years later, the number had risen above 182,000. Galveston had slave dealers and slave markets of its own. In 1860, Galveston County counted 1,520 enslaved people and only 2 free black residents alongside 6,707 white residents. The figures on the shipping ledgers did not record the hands that planted, chopped, picked, cleaned, and packed the crop. They recorded bales. By 1860, approximately 2/3 of all Texas cotton left through Galveston. Exports from the port were valued at $11 million. The bales accumulated in rows near the waterfront, their coarse coverings marked for merchants and destinations. They left the island in the same vessels that had brought in tools, cloth, machinery, wine, household goods, and people. The human traffic moved in the opposite direction. Revolutions, crop failures, political repression, and the promise of cheap land sent European immigrants toward Texas during the 1840s and 1850s. Germans arrived in especially large numbers, joined by Irish, English, French, and others. Some remained in Galveston as carpenters, masons, merchants, brewers, printers, and dock workers. Many stayed only long enough to find transport inland, carrying their trunks and tools towards settlements that would become part of the Texas-German belt. If you had stood on the bay side of the island in those years, the distinction would have been visible. Cotton waited to leave. People waited to continue. Ship traffic rose from 251 vessels in 1845 to 600 in 1854. That year, Michel Menard and other investors formed the Galveston Wharf and Cotton Press Company around 3 wharves. 5 years later, it had absorbed 7 more, with names that described both their owners and their materials: Palmetto, Central, Brick, Western, Labadie, Commercial, and Merchants. The separate fingers reaching into the harbor were becoming one hand. The city grew behind them. Newspapers received foreign reports before most of Texas. German craftsmen helped erect churches, commercial buildings, and houses. Schools opened. Warehouses became larger and more permanent. Yet every ship that brought new residents also carried the possibility of disease. Galveston suffered yellow fever in 1839, again in 1844, and repeatedly between 1847 and 1867. The port that connected the island to the world could not select what the world brought ashore. In 1859, the first railroad bridge joined Galveston Island to the mainland. The Galveston, Houston, and Henderson Railroad provided a continuous rail connection to Houston. Cotton no longer had to make the last stage entirely by wagon, riverboat, or coastal vessel. Rails could carry it toward the wharves. They could also carry business away from them. The test came with the Civil War. A United States blockade reached the Texas coast in 1861. Federal forces occupied Galveston the following year, and homes closed while merchants, warehouse operators, and records moved inland. Some firms located their headquarters to Houston. Cotton that had once crowded the waterfront waited on plantations or moved through blockade runners in smaller quantities. Confederate forces recaptured the island on January 1st, 1863. Galveston's defenders mounted a heavy cannon on a railroad car and pushed it along the tracks while firing at Union ships, one of the earliest recorded uses of rail-mounted artillery. The city changed hands. The blockade remained. When the war ended, Galveston again became the place where an outside decision entered Texas. Major General Gordon Granger arrived with United States troops and, on June 19, 1865, issued General Order No. 3. Its first declaration was plain. All enslaved people were free. The order described the former relationship between master and slave as one that would now exist between employer and hired labor. The sentence was issued from the same port whose wealth had been built by cotton. Ships returned. The custom house reopened. By 1867, exports through Galveston approached $23 million, more than twice their value on the eve of the war. Cotton again moved outward through the wharves. People continued to arrive. But the bridge to the mainland now led through Houston, and Houston had spent the war learning how much business could be kept there. After the Civil War, Galveston still possessed the harbor. Houston increasingly possessed the way to reach it. The distinction mattered because cotton did not appear at the waterfront by itself. It came from farms and plantations spread across hundreds of miles of Texas. Whoever controlled the rails between those fields and the coast could influence where the crop was stored, financed, sold, and shipped. By 1865, Houston had become the leading railroad center in the state. Lines reached from its muddy streets toward the Brazos Valley and the interior, gathering cotton before it approached the coast. Galveston's only railroad connection to the mainland ran directly through Houston. The island had the ships. Its rivals sat astride the track. The arrangement gave Houston leverage, but it was disease that made the leverage visible. Yellow fever was a real and recurring danger. In 1867, the disease struck Galveston so severely that approximately 3/4 of the population became ill. At the height of the outbreak, 20 people were dying each day. Houston had endured its own epidemics and understood what an infected ship, passenger, or piece of freight might carry inland. Quarantine was therefore a public health measure. It was also an economic weapon, whether intended as one or not. During the late 1860s and early 1870s, Houston repeatedly imposed restrictions on traffic moving from Galveston. The quarantines often coincided with the weeks when cotton was being marketed. Freight slowed. Rail cars waited. Merchants lost time while bales accumulated between the wharves and the interior. A shipper facing delay could send his cotton elsewhere. A buyer who could not reach Galveston could conduct business in Houston. Each interruption reminded the island's merchants that their city was connected to Texas by a railroad controlled at the other end. Galveston's answer was unusually direct. It would build another railroad. In May 1873, the Texas legislature chartered the Gulf, Colorado, and Santa Fe Railway. The name stated the ambition. The line was to begin at the Gulf, cross Texas, and eventually reach Santa Fe, New Mexico. More important to Galveston, it would enter the interior without passing through Houston. This was not merely a transportation project. It was an attempt by one city to redraw the commercial geography of a state. The proposed route left Galveston along Mechanic Street, turned west across the island, crossed Galveston Bay, and headed toward the agricultural country beyond Houston's immediate control. Construction began in 1875. Crews laid ties over wet coastal ground and built outward through prairie, where a railroad required bridges, drainage, depots, water stops, and settlements that did not yet exist. The first effort nearly failed. The company managed to complete roughly 50 miles of track, but had no adequate rolling stock and exhausted its money before the line could become the system its promoters had advertised. A railroad without locomotives was a pair of iron lines ending in grass. Galveston's merchants had too much at stake to leave it there. George Seeley led a group of local businessmen who took control of the troubled company and supplied new capital. The investors included names already attached to cotton, banking, wharves, insurance, and wholesale trade: Harris Kempner, Leon Blum, William Lewis Moody, John Seeley, George Ball, and others. They were not buying railway shares as a distant speculation. They were purchasing a route for their own cargo. Their businesses were separate on paper. At the waterfront, they were parts of the same machine. A banker financed cotton before shipment. A commission merchant arranged its sale. A warehouse held it. A press reduced its volume. A railroad carried it to the pier. A wharf company placed it beside the ship. Galveston's leading families held interests at several points in that sequence. Building the railroad protected all of them. The rails moved inland again. They crossed the Brazos River and reached toward Brenham and central Texas. New stations became shipping points. Towns developed beside the tracks, including places that carried the names of men connected to the railway: Seeley, Rosenberg, and Temple. A route designed to serve Galveston began fixing new communities onto the Texas map. By March 1881, the line had reached Belton, 226 miles from the coast. A telegraph wire ran beside the track, allowing information to move with a speed the cotton wagons never could. Prices, orders, train movements, and shipping instructions could arrive ahead of the freight. The railroad also carried something lighter. In 1880, another quarantine blocked ordinary traffic between Houston and Galveston. The Galveston News arranged for a special train to carry bundles of the newspaper inland over the new route. At Rosenberg, the papers were transferred to another railroad for distribution across Texas. News printed on the island traveled around Houston, even when other Galveston traffic could not pass through it. That detail is worth holding on to. The railroad was carrying not only bales, but the city's voice. The results appeared along the wharves. Galveston exported 233,496 bales of cotton to foreign markets in 1875. 5 years later, the port shipped 490,921 bales, enough to form a continuous wall of compressed fiber through warehouses, across rail platforms, and beside the channel. The city's population rose from 13,818 in 1870 to 22,248 in 1880. It remained the largest city in Texas. The bypass had worked, although not quite as purely as its founders imagined. As the Gulf, Colorado, and Santa Fe expanded, its directors discovered that Houston itself contained too much freight, too many customers, and too many connecting lines to ignore. In 1882, the company opened a branch from Alvin into the rival city. The railroad built to escape Houston now entered it from another direction. Galveston's larger purpose remained intact. The line pushed north, connected Dallas and Fort Worth to the coast, and attracted the attention of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. In 1886, Galveston's shareholders exchanged control of their company for $8 million in stock in the larger system. The arrangement promised a connection through Indian Territory and onward to Kansas City. By the following year, trains could travel between Kansas City and Galveston. Cotton from deeper inside Texas had a direct path to the island. Manufactured goods from the north could return over the same rails. Houston was no longer the single gate through which Galveston's inland traffic had to pass. The island had spent years building a road around one bottleneck. Now another remained directly in front of it. Even after reaching Galveston, the largest ships still faced shallow water at the entrance to the harbor. The railroad could bring the cotton to the sea. Galveston still had to bring the sea to the cotton. The railroad could deliver cotton to Galveston, but it could not carry a steamship across a sandbar. Inside the harbor, The water was deep enough to hold a fleet. Federal engineers measured 460 acres with depths of at least 30 feet, a sheltered basin broad enough for hulls, anchors, tugboats, and turning vessels. Yet between that basin and the Gulf lay two ridges of shifting sand. An 1852 survey found only 9.5 feet of water over the inner bar at low tide and 12 feet over the outer one. Galveston possessed deep water in the wrong place. Large vessels anchored beyond the bars, while smaller boats called lighters carried cargo between ship and shore. Cotton bales were loaded, unloaded, and loaded again. Every transfer meant another crew, another delay, another chance for rain or seawater to reach the fiber. A ship drawing too much water might enter only after part of its cargo had been removed, then wait to receive it again outside. The city had built railroads hundreds of miles across Texas, only to meet the final few feet of sand. The federal government began working on the entrance in 1870 with an appropriation of $25,000. Engineers extended a wooden pile jetty from the east end of the island. 3 years of labor deepened the passage by roughly 2.5 feet. It helped, but it did not create the harbor Galveston needed. The next attempt used gabions, wicker cylinders about 6 feet long and 6 feet high, packed with sand and coated with cement. They were lowered into the water to form a barrier against the moving bottom. A hurricane damaged the completed work within 3 years. The Gulf had reduced another engineering theory to broken wicker and scattered fill. Money arrived in fragments. Work began, slowed, stopped, and suffered damage, while Galveston waited for the next river and harbor bill. By 1886, the federal government had spent nearly $1.5 million at the entrance. When congressional appropriations stopped for several years, the city supplied $100,000 of its own in 1883. That number is worth pausing over. Galveston was paying locally for a passage intended to serve farms and railroads extending far beyond the island. But a half-built jetty was not half a deep-water port. It was stone and timber exposed to every tide while Congress reconsidered the bill. The political obstruction was nearly as persistent as the sand. Galveston's privately controlled wharves were accused of charging excessive rates and paying extravagant dividends. Company records showed that dividends never exceeded 6% and that its charges resembled those at competing ports. But the accusations traveled farther than the accounting. Other Texas cities had little reason to help Galveston secure a federally financed advantage over their own harbors. The first lobbying efforts failed for lack of regional support. Galveston then changed the scale of the argument. The Deep Water Committee, led by merchants including William L. Moody and supported by Harris Kempner, newspaper owner A.H. Bellow, and attorney Walter Gresham, began presenting Galveston not merely as a Texas port, but as the nearest ocean outlet for a wide interior. Interstate deepwater conventions gathered delegates from western states and territories. Their wheat, cattle, cotton, and machinery already moved across long stretches of rail. A deeper harbor promised to remove one costly transfer at the end. In 1889, Congress appointed 3 Army engineers to compare the possible deep-water sites along the northwestern Gulf. The board examined Sabine Pass, Aransas Pass, Corpus Christi, Brazos Santiago, the mouth of the Brazos River, and Galveston. Delegations offered testimony. Engineers inspected channels and railroad connections, measured water, studied currents, and calculated the distance from each proposed harbor to the open Gulf. Galveston had a serious disadvantage. Its jetties would have to extend farther than those at several rival locations, but it already had the city, the wharves, the railroads, and the deep basin behind the bar. In December 1889, the board selected Galveston as the site best suited for the harbor Congress wanted. Its estimate was $6,200,000. The plan did not depend on dredging alone. Two stone jetties would reach miles into the Gulf, narrowing the entrance and concentrating the tidal current between them. The water itself would become part of the machinery. Forced through a smaller opening at greater speed, it would scour sand from the bottom and carry it seaward. Beneath the stone, workers laid mattresses of bundled brush, some 3 feet thick, to keep the structure from sinking into the soft bottom. Rubble followed. Near the bar, individual blocks could weigh 6 to 8 tons. At their outer ends, the two jetties stood about 7,000 feet apart, long, low arms directing a current that had previously wandered across the entrance. Congress approved the harbor measure in September 1890. When the news reached Galveston by telegraph, the city erupted into celebration. Months of banquets, oyster roasts, parades, concerts, and harbor excursions followed. The ceremony was elaborate because the wait had lasted 20 years. Construction on the new works began in 1891. Pink granite came from Marble Falls in the Texas interior, traveling by railroad toward the same harbor it was meant to open. Barges carried it into position. Derricks lifted the blocks. A dredge worked between the growing walls while waves broke over fresh stone. By 1897, the finished jetties had helped create 26 feet of water over the outer bar. Ships that once waited offshore could cross with heavier cargoes in their holds. Cotton moved from railroad car to warehouse, from compress to wharf, and from wharf to ocean vessel with fewer interruptions. The railroad had brought the interior to Galveston. Now 2 lines of Texas granite reached out from the island and gave that interior a deeper road to sea. The strand ran parallel to the bay, 5 blocks of brick, iron, stone, and paperwork between 20th and 25th Streets. The wharves stood 1 block to the north. A merchant could leave his office, cross the muddy tracks and wagon traffic, and inspect the cargo on which his signature depended. This was not Wall Street in the New York sense. There were no towers, and few fortunes were made by trading shares in distant corporations. Galveston dealt in things that occupied space and acquired smells: cotton, grain, coffee, sugar, flour, hides, rope, tobacco, dry goods, and machinery. Its securities were warehouse receipts and bills of lading. Its market reports arrived with prices from New York and Liverpool. Its wealth could be counted in bales stacked high enough to block a warehouse window. By the late 19th century, the Strand held wholesalers, cotton brokers, commission merchants, attorneys, insurance offices, steamship agents, newspapers, and the 5 largest banks in Texas. In 1881 alone, $38 million in merchandise and services passed through businesses in the district. The money did not remain there long. It moved inland as credit, crossed the ocean as cotton, and returned as manufactured goods packed in crates and barrels. A cotton bale arriving by rail was more than a bundle of fiber. It might secure a planter's loan, satisfy a merchant's contract, fill part of a ship's cargo, and provide work for graders, weighers, compress operators, teamsters, clerks, and longshoremen. Each hand added a notation or a cost. Before the bale left Galveston, its weight, quality, owner, purchaser, destination, freight charge, storage fee, insurance, and commission had all been entered somewhere in ink. The commission houses stood near the center of that system. They advanced money against crops, arranged storage and sale, and connected inland producers with buyers who might never see Texas. The banks supplied the credit that kept the cotton moving before payment arrived from overseas. Insurance firms placed a price on fire, collision, wet cargo, and a ship that failed to reach port. The harbor handled the bale. The Strand handled nearly everything that could happen to it. Galveston's merchants had organized the first cotton exchange in Texas on May 6, 1873. The exchange was created after growers and buyers, each organized around their own interests, found themselves repeatedly in disputes over prices and terms. Its purpose was practical: establish trading rules, settle disagreements, and collect information about crops and markets. Within 3 years, the organization purchased the former Washington Hotel site at 21st Street and Mechanic. There it built a 3-story brick exchange that cost $102,000, including the land. When it opened in December 1878, the trading hall measured 83 feet by 63. Walnut and oak were laid into the floor. Decorative brackets around the room showed the cotton plant in successive stages of growth. A bell marked the opening and closing of trade. That bell is a small detail, but it reveals what Galveston had become. Cotton once sold through private conversation between a grower and a buyer. Now a formal trading day had edges. It began at a sound and ended at a sound. Between the two, men compared grades, read reports, challenged prices, and committed money against crops growing hundreds of miles away. In 1888 and 1889, the organization widened its name to the Galveston Cotton Exchange and Board of Trade. Its membership now included merchants dealing in grain, coffee, and produce. Cotton remained the foundation, but Galveston was building rooms large enough for other cargoes. The buildings outside grew heavier as well. Early businesses on the Strand had occupied wooden structures vulnerable to fire, wind, and salt air. Merchants replaced them with brick warehouses and iron fronts, narrow buildings made deep to hold goods behind offices facing the street. Cast iron columns supported upper floors. Tall windows admitted light to clerks working over ledgers in a city where an open flame could turn a row of warehouses into smoke. Architect Nicholas Clayton designed 15 commercial buildings on the Strand. His work gave physical form to businesses whose real product was confidence. Arches, cornices, pilasters, carved stone, and terracotta panels told depositors and distant correspondents that the firm behind the door intended to remain there. The clearest example appeared in 1895, when Ball, Hutchings and Company built new quarters for its banking and commission operations. From the street, the Hutchings and Seeley buildings appeared to be one structure. They were actually two adjoining buildings, one containing the bank and the other offices. Their materials came in layers of color and weight: gray and pink granite, red Texas sandstone, yellow brick, and buff terracotta. At the base, parts of the foundation walls were 6 feet wide. On the stonework appeared two dates. The first, 1854, marked the founding of the firm. The second, 1895, marked the building. 41 years of credit had been converted into masonry. Ball, Hutchings and Company had begun as a partnership dealing in wholesale goods and banking. Its partners and their families invested in wharves, railroads, steamship service, hospitals, and real estate. Similar connections ran throughout Galveston. The same names appeared on bank doors, railroad boards, cotton firms, charitable institutions, and warehouse deeds. Capital on the island did not divide itself neatly by industry. A banker might help finance a steamship, control shares in a wharf, and lend money to the merchant filling that ship. Below the offices, the physical work continued. Wagons rattled over uneven streets. Rail cars stood beside brick warehouses. Cotton dust clung to clothing and collected in cracks. At the compresses, bulky bales were squeezed into denser packages so that a ship could carry more of them. On the docks, longshoremen rolled and levered the compressed bales into holds, building walls of cotton beneath the decks. The stone fronts faced south, toward the city. Their rear windows and loading doors faced the harbor that made them necessary. By the middle of the 1890s, Galveston had assembled the entire mechanism in one narrow strip of island: rails from the interior, deep water at the entrance, warehouses beside the tracks, banks beside the warehouses, and an exchange bell that divided speculation from settlement one trading day at a time. The nickname followed the machinery: Wall Street of the Southwest. And beyond the Strand, clerks were beginning to total the manifests. By 1899, the Deep Water Project had done what its advocates promised. Steamships crossed the outer bar, passed between the granite jetties, and entered a harbor connected by rail to cotton fields in Texas and wheat farms hundreds of miles beyond it. Along the wharves, masts, funnels, derricks, grain spouts, boxcars, and warehouse roofs formed a second city facing the bay. Galveston was now described as the fifth most important port in the United States. Port rankings were never simple. One table measured tonnage, another the value of foreign trade, another vessels entered and cleared. Galveston did not stand fifth by every measure. Its place came largely from the value of what left its docks, especially cotton. In 1899, it was the leading cotton exporting city in the United States and was widely described as the foremost cotton port in the world. The customs ledgers show how quickly the harbor had grown. In the fiscal year ending in 1895, Galveston exported domestic merchandise valued at nearly $42 million. 4 years later, the total exceeded $78 million. In the fiscal year ending June 30, 1900, it reached $85,657,000. The federal census counted 37,789 people in Galveston that same year. Put the two records beside each other, and the port exported more than $2,200 in goods for every man, woman, and child living on the island. That was not money divided among them. It was value moving past them, through warehouses, across scales beneath cotton hooks, and into ships. Cotton created most of the motion. Trains arrived carrying loose, bulky bales that occupied too much space for an ocean voyage. At the compresses, steam-powered machinery forced each bale into a smaller, harder block held together by iron bands. In 1894, William L. Moody and Company built the first dockside cotton compress in Texas, removing another movement between warehouse and vessel. High-density compression turned empty air into freight capacity. A denser bale meant that more cotton could fit below deck. More bales in the same hull lowered the cost of carrying each one across the Atlantic. Galveston's geography had given it a harbor. Its machinery made that harbor profitable by the cubic foot. The final packing still required men. Specialized longshoremen used screwjacks to force bales tightly into the holds, working in heat, dust, and cramped spaces beneath the deck. White screwmen had long controlled access to the best-paid loading work. Black longshoremen, excluded from their organization, formed the Cotton Jams Jammers Association. Norris Wright Cuney helped turn that association into a competing labor force. In 1883, he purchased $2,500 in tools and brought additional black dock workers from New Orleans. His crews eventually secured contracts from the Morgan shipping interests. 6 years later, Cuney became Collector of Customs at Galveston, the federal official responsible for the same port where his stevedores had fought for the right to work. He died in 1898, 1 year before Galveston took first place in cotton. The port was no longer dependent upon cotton alone. Grain elevators rose beside the tracks, receiving wheat from Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma, and the Indian Territory. Grain arrived in rail cars and left through chutes that poured it into a ship's hold in a continuous stream. In 1899, 1900, and 1901, Galveston surpassed New Orleans as the leading wheat exporting port on the Gulf. Cotton could be gripped, rolled, counted, and stacked. Wheat behaved differently. It flowed into cracks, produced dust, and pressed against walls with the weight of water. A cotton warehouse held thousands of separate packages. A grain elevator held a harvest as one mass. Together, the two commodities filled vessels bound for Liverpool, Bremen, Havre, Manchester, Genoa, Hamburg, Antwerp, and Rotterdam. The names appeared in shipping columns and manifests, making a Texas island part of the daily calculations of spinners, millers, bankers, and shipowners across Europe. The railroads had widened the port's reach in the other direction. The Gulf, Colorado, and Santa Fe brought grain south from Kansas. Other lines carried cotton and cottonseed products from Texas and the territories. A crop no longer needed to grow near the Gulf to leave through Galveston. The city had become the narrow point through which a broad interior passed. It also looked increasingly like a city built to keep that position. The University of Texas opened its medical department in Galveston in 1891 with one building and fewer than 50 students. The Grand Opera House opened in 1894, its Romanesque walls enclosing touring plays, music, and public gatherings. Electric streetcars moved residents through streets lined with banks, churches, schools, hotels, boarding houses, and Victorian homes. On the Strand, the Cotton Exchange Bell still opened and closed the trading day. On the wharves, steam whistles answered locomotive bells. Telegraph messages carried prices faster than ships could carry goods. A change in Liverpool could reach a Galveston office, while the cotton itself remained stacked across the street. The scale of the commerce could make the island appear larger than it was. $85 million in exports belonged to a city with fewer residents than many inland towns that never appeared in national port tables. Its commercial reach extended across an ocean and deep into the plains, but its streets occupied only the eastern end of a strip of sand. There was no seawall between those streets and the Gulf. Homes, churches, hospitals, tracks, warehouses, and the fifth port in the United States stood on ground so flat that distant ships sometimes appeared to be moving through the city itself. The highest point was 8.7 feet above sea level. The storm reached Galveston first as incomplete information. On September 4, 1900, the city learned that a tropical cyclone had crossed Cuba. Weather reports placed it somewhere in the Gulf, but there were no satellites, aircraft, radar images, or radio messages from ships at sea. Observations traveled by telegraph from scattered stations on land. Between those stations lay hundreds of miles of warm water, and a hurricane growing stronger where no instrument could follow it. Storm warning flags rose above the Galveston Weather Bureau. Its chief observer, Isaac Klein, watched the barometer, wind, and tide. The warnings were distributed by telephone and by messengers on bicycles, but there was no order to evacuate the island. Galvestonians had seen high tides before. They called them overflows. Water might cover low streets, float loose lumber, and provide children with an afternoon's excitement before draining away. Saturday, September 8, began with rain and a heavy sea. Families continued their errands. Workers reported for duty. People gathered near the Gulf to watch waves strike the beach. The water did not drain away. By early afternoon, streets near the Gulf were filling. Wind reached storm force around 1 o'clock and continued to rise. Houses closest to the beach began to take water beneath their floors. Residents moved furniture upstairs, carried children onto beds, and crossed flooded streets toward larger buildings. The routes inland were disappearing as they used them. Klein sent what became the final message from Galveston before communication failed. Gulf rising rapidly, half the city now underwater. Telegraph lines went down. Bridges connecting the island to the mainland collapsed. The fifth port had become an isolated strip of sand holding nearly 38,000 people. At about 5 in the afternoon, the wind reached hurricane force. The Weather Bureau instrument registered sustained winds of 84 miles an hour and gusts near 100 before the equipment failed. Later meteorologists estimated that the hurricane's winds reached roughly 140 miles an hour. But wind alone did not destroy Galveston. The storm pushed the Gulf onto the island. Later calculations placed the surge at approximately 15 7/10 feet. That figure did not mean 15 feet of water stood evenly across every street. It meant the surface of the sea had risen nearly 16 feet above its ordinary level, while waves moved across the top of it. Galveston's highest ground was 8.7 feet. Water crossed the island from the Gulf and met water driven through the bay. Houses rose from their foundations, shifted and broke apart. Lumber, slate, doors, fences, furniture, telegraph poles, and entire sections of roof entered the current. One collapsing building supplied the material that struck the next. The wreckage accumulated into a moving barrier, gathering weight as it advanced through successive rows of homes. The city became its own battering ram. Near the western edge of Galveston stood St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, operated by the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. 10 sisters were caring for 94 children. As the water approached, they moved the children from the boys' dormitory into the newer and stronger girls' building. They tried to keep the children calm by singing a hymn called Queen of the Waves. When the building began to fail, the sisters tied children to themselves with clothesline, 6 or 8 to each woman, hoping that the groups would remain together in the water. The orphanage collapsed. All 10 sisters died. Only 3 children survived. Across the city, survival often depended upon the point at which a house broke, the direction a wall fell, or whether floating timber could be held in darkness. Families climbed into attics only to find water rising beneath them. Others cut through roofs. People crowded into brick buildings and large homes until floors bowed under their weight. Isaac Klein's house sheltered his family and dozens of neighbors. When it collapsed, Klein, his brother Joseph, and Klein's 3 daughters survived amid floating wreckage. Klein's pregnant wife, Cora, did not. The wind drove rain and salt water horizontally. Roof slate and splintered boards moved through the air. Survivors used planks as shields against debris. Between crashes, they heard voices from people trapped beneath walls or carried into the water. Lightning occasionally exposed the wreckage, then left the city dark again. The center of the hurricane passed during the evening. Wind direction changed, pushing debris and water along new paths. Buildings that had resisted pressure from one side now received it from another. The violence continued until near midnight. Sunday morning arrived with a calm gulf. At least 2,636 houses had been destroyed. Galveston's answer to 15 feet of water was not to retreat from the Gulf. It was to place concrete between the city and the sea, then lift the city behind it. A 3-member board of engineers began with the dimensions of the disaster. Henry Martin Robert, Alfred Noble, and Henry Clay Ripley proposed a curved concrete wall more than 3 miles long, rising 17 feet above mean low tide. It would begin near the South Jetty, wrap around the eastern edge of the island, and continue west along the beach, standing where the storm had driven houses, streetcars, and pieces of railroad track into the city. Construction began in October 1902. Crews drove timber piles 40 to 50 feet into the sand, set sheet piling against the Gulf side, and poured the wall in interlocking sections. Its base was 16 feet wide. Its top was 5. Each foot of completed wall weighed roughly 20 tons, with granite blocks spread beyond its seaward face to keep the Gulf from digging underneath. The quantities belonged to a railroad ledger. Thousands of carloads of crushed granite, sand, cement, timber piling, and stone riprap. Yet the finished city section, completed in July 1904, came within $326 of the contracted price. That number is worth pausing over. The seawall could break waves, but it created another problem. Much of Galveston still stood only 5 or 6 feet above mean low tide. A wall without higher ground behind it might protect the city from the direct force of the surf while leaving water trapped among the houses, warehouses, churches, and streets. Galveston therefore attempted the more difficult half of the plan. It raised the ground. Work began in December 1903, one neighborhood at a time. Engineers divided the city into quarter-mile squares, each containing about 16 blocks, and enclosed each square within temporary dikes. Before sand could be pumped in, everything that occupied the old level had to be lifted or moved. houses, stores, churches, sidewalks, fences, streetcar rails, sewer lines, gas pipes, water mains, fire hydrants, telephone poles, and telegraph poles. The National Park Service records 2,146 buildings raised in advance of the fill. Other histories round the total to about 2,200. The difference is fewer than 60 buildings in a project that lifted much of a living city. Workers placed hand-operated jack screws beneath the structures. Crews turned them in small, coordinated movements so that plaster would not split, walls would not twist, and chimneys would not pull away from roofs. A frame cottage might rise on a forest of timber supports. A brick building required more iron, more cribbing, and closer attention to every fraction of an inch. St. Patrick's Church weighed approximately 3,000 tons. 700 jack screws lifted it 5 feet. For a time the church stood above the earth that had once supported it, its Gothic walls resting on machinery and timber while men worked below. Around it, homes and shops occupied the same strange middle distance. Their front doors remained where they had always been on the map, but the ground beneath them had disappeared. The residents did not necessarily move out. Families continued to cook, sleep, and carry water inside houses held above the street on wooden supports. Boardwalks were fastened to the tops of fences, creating narrow paths 8 or 10 feet in the air. If you had walked through one of those sections, a neighbor's roof might have remained at its familiar height, while the sidewalk had become a plank suspended over wet sand, pipes, laborers, and slowly rising earth. To obtain enough fill, contractors cut a canal directly through the residential district. It was 2.5 miles long, 200 feet wide, and 20 feet deep, broad enough for self-loading hopper dredges to enter the city. About 350 houses were temporarily moved aside to clear its path. The dredges gathered sand from between the harbor jetties, deepening the entrance that had made Galveston rich, then steamed inland through the new canal. At discharge points, pumps forced a slurry of seawater and sand through networks of pipe. Brown water spread beneath the elevated buildings, curled around the jack screws, and pressed against the temporary dikes. The water drained away. The sand remained. Layer by layer, the island rose. Once a section reached its new elevation, workers built foundations on top of the fill and lowered the buildings onto them. Streets were graded. Tracks were relaid. Pipes and hydrants returned to service. Trees, shrubs, and flower beds were salvaged where they could be. When portions of the canal were no longer needed, they too were dammed and filled, and the displaced houses were carried back to their lots. The new surface was not level. Immediately behind the seawall, the fill rose more than 16 feet above portions of the former grade. From there, the city descended gradually toward Galveston Bay, about 1 foot for every 1,500 feet, giving rainwater and sewage a slope they had never possessed before. By the end of the main work in 1911, approximately 500 blocks had received 16.3 million cubic yards of sand. Spread across a football field, that volume would have formed a column of earth more than 5 miles high. In Galveston, it lay beneath parlors, church pews, streetcar lines, brick storefronts, and the bedrooms where people had remained while the ground came up to meet them. Additional areas continued to be filled until 1928. The wall faced the Gulf. The streets leaned toward the harbor. Galveston had used sand from its shipping channel to lift itself above the water that had destroyed it. 50 miles inland, Houston was preparing the opposite operation. It was digging down. In 1912, 12 years after the hurricane, Galveston ranked second among United States ports in the total value of its imports and exports. More than 4 million bales of cotton crossed its wharves that year, compressed into dense blocks, rolled through warehouses, and lowered into ships bound for Europe. The seawall had not saved a dying port. It had protected a busy one. Yet, while Galveston had been lifting streets and houses, Houston had been removing mud from Buffalo Bayou. The work was less visible than a concrete wall facing the Gulf, but its purpose was more ambitious. Houston intended to bring oceangoing ships 50 miles inland, past Galveston Island, across Galveston Bay, through the San Jacinto River, and into a turning basin near the city's warehouses and railroad yards. The idea was older than the storm. In the 19th century, small steamers and shallow vessels had worked their way along Buffalo Bayou, carrying cotton, lumber, and merchandise between Houston and the bay. The route twisted through low, marshy country, its banks lined with reeds, mud, and timber. Sandbars and sunken logs could stop a vessel. Floods could move the channel. During dry periods, the water itself became an argument against calling Houston a port. Charles Morgan had begun changing that in the 1870s. After quarreling with Galveston's wharf interests, his company developed docks at Clinton, below Houston, connected them to the city by 7 miles of railroad, and dredged a channel approximately 12 feet deep toward the Gulf. It was an early version of the same maneuver Houston had used against Galveston's railroad strategy. Cargo arriving from the Texas interior already passed through Houston. If ships could reach the same place, the last 50 miles of rail could be removed from the bill. The hurricane of 1900 did not invent Houston's ambition, and it did not empty Galveston's wharves. But it placed a new figure on every merchant's calculation: the cost of keeping cotton, records, equipment, and borrowed money on an island open to the Gulf. Houston's campaign continued in Washington under Congressman Thomas Henry Ball, who had been pressing for a deep-water channel since his election in 1896. Federal officials had spent millions improving Galveston Harbor. Houston proposed a different arrangement. Harris County would provide half the cost of dredging its channel if the federal government supplied the other half. This cost-sharing offer became known as the Houston Plan, the first time a local government had offered to match federal money for a navigation project of this kind. Congress accepted it. In 1911, Harris County voters approved $1,250,000 in bonds for the local share. Approval did not turn paper into cash. The bonds still had to be sold, and Houston banker and builder Jesse H. Jones approached the city's banks, asking each to purchase part of the issue until none remained. The money bought dredging. Machines cut a channel 25 feet deep through 50 miles of bay, river, and bayou. Their buckets and suction pipes lifted mud that had accumulated over centuries, depositing it along banks where refineries, docks, grain elevators, and storage tanks would later stand. The waterway was not straightened into a clean industrial line. It still bent through the coastal plain, but now an oceangoing hull could follow it inland. On the morning of September 7, 1914, the dredge Texas sounded its whistle to announce that the work was complete. 2 months later, thousands gathered at the turning basin for the formal opening. A band played from a barge. White roses were scattered over the water. President Woodrow Wilson, sitting in Washington, pressed a button that sent an electrical signal to fire a cannon in Houston. The sound marked the opening of a seaport without a seacoast. The ceremony arrived at an awkward moment. Europe was already at war. Shipping was disrupted, cotton markets had closed temporarily, and the new channel did not immediately fill with ocean steamers. For several years, Galveston remained the established port, with its agents, warehouses, compresses, pilots, rail connections, and scheduled shipping lines already in place. Then, in 1919, an oceangoing vessel named Marymount loaded cotton at Houston and carried it directly to a foreign market. The cargo itself was familiar. The route was not. Cotton arriving by rail no longer had to continue to Galveston before entering a ship. It could be classified, financed, compressed, stored, and loaded in Houston. Each step removed another reason for a cotton office to remain on the strand. Within a decade of the Marymount's voyage, Houston had become the leading cotton port in the United States. Oil widened the difference. Galveston could load petroleum, but Houston's channel offered miles of protected waterfront near the fields, pipelines, railroads, and open land required by refineries. A refinery did not need a marble lobby or an ornate cornice. It needed acreage, tanks, pipe racks, stills, loading docks, and water deep enough for a tanker. By 1930, 9 refineries operated along the channel, their stacks and cylindrical storage tanks forming an industrial shoreline where marsh and timber had stood. Galveston continued to move cotton, grain, troops, and wartime cargo. Its wharves did not fall silent, but major cotton firms moved inland, closer to the railroad junctions and farther from the hurricane line. Houston's municipally supported facilities expanded while Galveston's largely private wharf company paid taxes, maintained its property, and returned dividends to its owners. One port could build with public credit. The other still carried the structure of the 19th century. By 1936, Houston's man-made harbor had become the largest port in Texas. Galveston possessed the natural entrance, the deepened bar, the 5 miles of jetties, and the wall that had held back the Gulf. Houston possessed 50 miles of dredged water. The ships followed the trench. Money did not leave the Strand in a single procession. It disappeared desk by desk, ledger by ledger. As cotton firms moved inland, shipping offices followed the railroads, and bankers found that Houston placed them closer to both the crop and the ship. Galveston continued handling millions of bales. Its warehouses remained capable, its pilots knew the harbor, and its wharves still received vessels from across the Atlantic. Yet the machinery behind the cargo was changing. Cotton could now be financed, classified, compressed, and loaded in Houston without paying for the last 50 miles to the island. A bale that never reached Galveston required no Galveston warehouse, no Galveston broker, and no loan from a bank on the Strand. In 1926, Hutchings, Seeley and Company gave up its old private partnership structure and became a national bank. Federal rules restricted how much lending it could concentrate in one commodity, and cotton sometimes required more than $2 million in credit each day. The bank that had helped make the Strand the Wall Street of the Southwest could no longer finance cotton in quite the way the Strand had taught Texas to finance it. The wharves faced the same tightening circle. Houston and other publicly owned ports could borrow for improvements without paying dividends to private shareholders. Galveston's wharf company had to maintain docks, pay taxes, compete on rates, and still answer to its owners. Houston cotton firms cut compression charges by 30 cents a bale. Galveston responded by creating a truck line with more than 500 trucks and trailers, hauling cotton and wool from as far away as El Paso. The fleet ran for 3 years and lost $124,000. By 1938, the wharves earned about $167,000, while paying nearly $295,000 in taxes. The numbers had crossed. In 1940, after more than 80 years of private control, the Galveston Wharf Company sold its holdings to the city for just over $6 million. The docks became a municipal utility governed by a board of trustees. Galveston had not lost its port, but the institution at the center of its 19th century economy no longer belonged to the families whose offices faced the harbor. The port remained busy. During the Second World War, ships carried troops and supplies. Grain elevators swallowed harvests from the interior. Rail cars still moved along the waterfront, and longshoremen still worked cargo beneath cranes and warehouse roofs. By 1946, the wharves contained 6 miles of concrete dockage, 47 miles of railroad track, and an elevator capable of holding 6 million bushels of grain. But much of that activity no longer required the Strand. Business offices moved elsewhere. Department stores followed newer streets and suburban customers. The cotton exchanges and commission houses that had once filled upper floors with clerks, samples, telegrams, and cigar smoke contracted or closed. The buildings remained, but their original purpose leaked away slowly enough that no single year could be called the end. By the 1960s, many Strand buildings stood partly vacant or deteriorating. Their iron columns rusted beneath layers of paint. Water entered through roofs, wooden floors sagged. Some structures were demolished, leaving holes in blocks that had once presented an almost unbroken wall of brick, stone, cast iron, shutters, loading doors, and painted business names. Their survival was partly a result of the decline itself. Galveston lacked the pressure to replace every old warehouse with a taller office building. Structures too solid to fall and too unprofitable to modernize simply waited. The Galveston Historical Foundation, incorporated as a preservation organization in 1954, began treating the old commercial district as something other than exhausted real estate. The Strand entered the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. 3 years later, a revolving fund was established to purchase threatened buildings and resell them under restoration agreements, with support from the Moody Foundation and the Kempner Fund. The names were familiar. Families whose money had once circulated through cotton, banking, insurance, and shipping were now financing the survival of the rooms where that circulation had occurred. George Mitchell added another turn to the story. He had been born in Galveston in 1919, the son of Greek immigrants, and had grown up in a neighborhood known as the League of Nations. He made his fortune in oil and natural gas after settling in Houston, the city that had drawn so much commerce away from his birthplace. In the mid-1970s, he and his wife Cynthia began purchasing and restoring Strand buildings. Progress was slow. As late as 1984, only 12 businesses operated within the historic district. Old warehouses had to be fitted with wiring, plumbing, ventilation, and fire protection without stripping away the iron fronts, brick walls, tall windows, and heavy timber interiors that made them worth preserving. In 1976, the Strand became a National Historic Landmark District. By 1991, nearly 50 iron front buildings across 5 blocks had been restored. The counting rooms became shops, restaurants, galleries, offices, museums, and hotel rooms. Cotton samples disappeared from the windows. Visitors arrived where brokers once waited for prices from Liverpool. Across Harborside Drive, cargo vessels, grain ships, and cruise liners continued using the harbor that had created the street. One physical fact remained beneath all of it. When Galveston raised approximately 500 blocks after the hurricane, the new grade sloped down toward the bay. The Strand and the waterfront were not lifted. While houses farther south rose on jack screws and millions of cubic yards of sand entered the city, Avenue B remained near its 19th century elevation. It remains there now. Beyond the iron fronts, ships move along the harbor behind Pelican Island. Their upper decks pass above warehouse roofs before turning through the channel toward the jetties. Behind the Strand, the raised city climbs gradually toward the seawall. In front of it, only a few blocks away, water presses against the wharves. The street stays between them, on the old ground.